The MegaMan series, despite its ups and downs throughout the years, has always been accompanied by a very dedicated fanbase. And one of the many proofs of that statement is the long list of fangames that have risen, grown, and released during the last 2 decades. Most of those projects carry an insane amount of passion, and their quality, despite having very small teams behind their creation, is often outstanding. But even with its popularity, MegaMan X, one of the most beloved ramifications of the series, had never received a fangame since its first appearance back in '93. That was until earlier this year. As we still wait for the holy grail of passion projects to finally leave the kitchen, 2 projects have broken through the barrier. The first of them was MegaMan X4KB, released on June 1st, 2024, and the second one, and the protagonist of this video, MegaMan X8-16Bit Demake, whose debut took place on September 6th, 2024. This project, developed entirely by AllysonDaPaz, aims to recreate MegaMan X8 through the design conventions of the now classic SNES trilogy, while reworking and improving on some of the intricacies of the PS2 original. Whether it succeeds or fails at this purpose is the question that brings us here today. Thus, I hope you all are comfy at the other side of the screen, because I'm about to dive in. Let's get this show started. Although, before jumping into the nitties and the gritties about this demake, allow me to quickly summarize what the deal is all about, just in case you want to play the game by yourselves before watching the rest of the review. I'm gonna get into spoiler territory after this section is done, so I wouldn't want to ruin some of this game's most hidden surprises. So, as said during the intro, this project is a reconstruction of MegaMan X8, following the design identity of the original SNES trilogy. In case you're not familiar with X8, it was released for the PlayStation 2 back in 2005, and almost 20 years later, it's still the very last official mainline entry on the X Saga. At that point, the Blue Maverick Hunter had come a long way, and this final title wasn't shy to keep building upon what was established on previous adventures. That said, since this demake works under the rules of X1 through 3, some stuff had to go. I'll get into the details of what this means later throughout the video, but what you probably want to know right away is that this is a solo adventure for X. Both Zero and Axel, as well as the team-up mechanic of the original, are not part of the demake. Gone too are other members of the Maverick Hunters, like Cygnus and all navigators except for Alia, who very briefly appears in 1 or 2 occasions. The original game's currency system is not featured here either, as well as the shop that was directly attached to it. Same goes for the retry chips, which are replaced by traditional extra lives. The removal of any other characters aside from X and the villains also results in the story being simplified, taking out most of the cutscenes, yet still keeping part of the themes that make up the plot. While this may sound concerning for fans of the OG game, I believe you should still give this game a try, since it's a very high quality project that makes up for its more simple approach. In fact, I'll let you know about this right off the gate. I think the good changes outweigh the bad ones, and I only noticed something was missing on just 1 or 2 occasions. That said, from this point onward, I'm getting into details, so this is your last call to take a look at the game before I discuss all of what it has to offer. I'll make sure to leave a link to the game's website down in the description, so you guys can give it a shot. Alright, ready or not, here we go. After suffering from the effects of the Sigma virus and the destruction ensued by the events of the last few entries, Earth is in a dire state. Thus, humanity has chosen to colonize the moon in an attempt to create a safe haven while the old planet heals from its wounds. This operation is known as the Jacob Project, which will be set into motion as soon as the orbital elevator, a pathway that connects the blue planet with its satellite, is completed. The plot begins with X being sent to investigate the crash landing of one of the elevator's cars, which malfunctioned and detached on its way down. Upon finding the broken vessel, X finds that the passenger was none other than Lumine, the director of the Jacob project, and a part of the new generation of Reploids, who have the ability to copy the DNA of any existing Reploid, as well as having total immunity to the Sigma virus. Just when the day seems to be saved, Vile, who was presumed to be dead, surprisingly comes into the scene and kidnaps Lumine, warning X that he and his fellow Mavericks are about to assume control of the orbital elevator, and then take over the Jacob project. From this point onward, the story takes a backseat, except for some brief encounters with Vile until the endgame kicks in, where Sigma is revealed to be the one behind the attack on the Jacob project. However, in a very interesting twist, Lumine emerges as the real villain after being rescued, having used Sigma as a stepping stone to create a world only for new generation Reploids. Despite his superior capabilities, Lumine falls in battle against X, who finishes him right on the spot in what feels like a mercy kill. Having completed his mission, X descends the orbital elevator once more, destination home. Even if it's clear that it's not the main focus of the project, I believe it's kinda sad that the story was completely cast aside. Sure, it's hardly going to deeply affect your enjoyment of the game, but I feel like it was a missed opportunity to improve on what the original game proposed. X8's plot attempted to introduce many interesting themes, like the main cast dealing with the idea of becoming outdated, and the desperate attempts of humanity to step away from the Maverick Wars. In the end, these aspects were barely touched upon, and that is a shame, especially for a series that, compared to classic Mega Man, puts a lot more effort into its characters. With X8 Demake, that's 2 times that this plot and setting have been used, and none of them chose to develop its themes and characters. I bring this up because, while 16-bit Demake keeps the pre-boss dialogue, those aren't directly taken from the PS2 version. Instead, they have been rewritten, while keeping a similar vibe going on. I am aware the scope of the project was meant to be simpler, but to me, it feels like there was an attempt at doing something cool with these characters, that doesn't go beyond just that, an intention. This is the only occasion where I felt like 16-bit Demake was missing something. Although the SNES trilogy isn't the best showcase of video game narrative, it's still a part of what makes this game special. It's the reason why people still remember these characters even after so many years. While we won't be seeing any familiar faces, those characters who are featured in this game are beautifully animated. In fact, the presentation is easily one of the game's biggest strengths, with very detailed sprites, complex backgrounds, and many lighting and visual effects that makes every single screen a joy to your senses. Even huge enemies, which are significantly harder to animate, are surprisingly detailed, so kudos! The visual department in this game is genuinely excellent. It is true that not every sprite is new, but repurposed assets are used very intelligently, giving this fangame a sense of visual identity. Even when you recognize where a certain sprite comes from, they don't clash with each other, which is a common mistake in projects like these, but 16-bit Demake is immune to it. The game even allows you to use built-in CRT filters, and while the strong one is a bit much for me personally, I do love how the soft version looks like. It's quite convincing. One thing I must bring up though is that all of these fancy graphics make the game slightly heavier when it comes to system requirements. This is mentioned on the game's FAQ board, but the game seems to be prone to stuttering at certain points, even on a decent PC, so it might be related to optimization issues. Despite those, I was still able to run the game on my old laptop, which has an Intel i3 and a 2015 graphics card, so don't worry too much about it. I did experience some oddities, like X's armor disappearing at certain points and him becoming invisible after taking a hit, but none of these make the game unplayable. It's just something you need to be wary of if you have a low-end machine. Now that I'm talking about the technical side, the game has different language settings, those being English, Spanish and Portuguese. This is something I really appreciate. However, while I cannot judge the Portuguese translation, I can say that the Spanish version is quite faulty in particular. It's filled with grammar errors, clunky phrases, there is a constant lack of punctuation, and some dialogue and interface text boxes go outside the boundaries they are supposed to be contained in. It's still readable, yes, but there is a ton of room for improvement here. That said, let's jump from eyes to ears. I usually have a section discussing the soundtrack and how well it works with the game itself. However, 16-Bit Demake chooses to use the original tracks, directly from MegaMan X8's OST. I would have loved to see an adaptation of those pieces using the classic SNES sound, but you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, or so they say. In fact, playing this game made me appreciate some of these tracks a lot more. That is because the PS2 version of X8 struggled a lot with audio mixing, which often resulted in music being overshadowed by the multiple voices and sound effects. The Demake removes quite a bunch of those, so hearing the background music is much easier. That said, audio mixing on the Demake is all over the place too. Common sounds like jumping, dashing and shooting all have different levels of volume, while others like some enemy attacks or the sound that plays when you get hit are much louder. Some music tracks, like the Weapon Get song, also play at noticeably higher volume levels compared to the rest of the soundtrack. I did try to tinker with the sound settings multiple times, but that didn't make any difference, unfortunately. Leaving that behind, visuals and the story, or its absence in this case, can be a part of the experience, but the core of a game is always its most important facet. So then, how good is that gameplay, you ask? Holy macaroni! Alright, we hop off from X8 16-Bit Demake's lesser aspects into the ones that make it shine with blinding lights. Considering this is a fast-paced 2D action platformer, controls and the physics of your avatar need to be on point. And in this case, they are honestly perfect. X behaves exactly how you'd expect, and everything responds to player inputs with the distinct quality of an official Mega Man game. Dashing, jumping and wall climbing feels really good, and in case you're not happy with the default control scheme, the game allows you to rebind all of your actions, no matter if you're using a keyboard or a controller. Speaking of which, despite hearing that some people had issues when plugging their controllers, I didn't run into any problems myself, and my trusty DualShock 4 works perfectly right out of the gate. Just like the controls, the structure of the game meets the expectations that will be attached to any Mega Man X game. As soon as you exit Noah's Park, the intro stage, you can proceed into the 8 main levels in any desired order. After completing a stage, X will copy the special weapon of the defeated boss, and that weapon can be used to easily defeat another one of the 8 Mavericks. Once those 8 Mavericks have been taken care of, there are 3 endgame stages that come in the form of the Jacob Elevator, the Gateway, which is where you'll face the traditional boss rush, and finally the Moon, where Sigma's palace is located. Exploration is once again a very important part of the experience, since in place of X8's shop, which became the only way to increase X's capabilities, 16-Bit Demake brings back the much more fun scavenger hunt, in search for the 8 heart containers, the 4 refillable sub-tanks, and 2 sets of armors that X can wear to acquire new abilities. And, just like in the original, you can mix and match any parts between those 2 sets, which allows players to customize their build. To make this work, unlike other entries of the series, where every armor had a radically different purpose, X8 sets are a bit more balanced between each other, and 16-Bit Demake has kept that idea. On one hand, there's Hermes armor, which is designed around speed, with a triple charge shot with reduced charge time, infinite ammo for non-charged special weapons, and a dash that grants invincibility. To counterbalance this, the chest piece doesn't reduce damage, opting instead for letting you regain lost health if you damage enemies shortly after taking a hit. On the flip side, there's the Icarus armor, which is centered around mobility and raw attack power. Third level charge becomes this massive laser that will stay active for quite a while. Charged special weapons will not consume ammo anymore, defense is increased, and X gets not only a double jump but a double air dash. To balance out the fact that you can create a custom build out of these 8 parts, wearing all 4 pieces of the same set unlocks the usage of X Drive, a special technique that has a different effect depending on the armor that X is wearing. Hermes turns X invincible for a few seconds, and Icarus has a screen nuke attack that destroys every enemy on screen and deals a decent chunk of damage to bosses. Moving past the shiny collectibles, one common critique about X8 is how its gameplay felt gimmicky at times, because of Central White and Dynasty, 2 of the 8 main levels, being fully occupied by ride chaser sections. During these, players would have to ride their turbo bikes while shooting enemies and dodging obstacles like bombs or bottomless pits. X8-16-Bit Demake opts instead for reworking those levels to stay true to the mechanics of the original trilogy, which means that the ride chasers control similarly to how they used to back in MegaMan X2. That said, despite its high fidelity, the Demake brings some quality of life improvements introduced after the SNES games, like X having both the dash and the air dash by default, being able to shoot the Buster while a special weapon is equipped, or the introduction of analog weapon swapping. This feature made its debut in MegaMan 11, and it allows you to activate any of the 8 weapons with just a slight tilt of the right stick. Oh, and speaking of weapons, ammo is also refilled every time you enter a stage or lose a life. On the opposite side, some quirks about the first trilogy made its way into this fan game, like sub-tanks not being able to fully heal you, and the game having only one save file, despite dropping passwords in favor of a modern autosave system. Speaking of modern editions, X8-16-Bit Demake even has a built-in achievements list, which I personally appreciate a lot. That said, there have been reports of some of these chibos not working properly, so an update or 2 will probably fix it. But if there is one thing I can say, is that I'd wish each achievement had a dedicated icon, since it would make the list much easier to scroll through. Despite all of that, a solid set of mechanics requires some quality level design to truly shine. So, how does X8-16-Bit Demake fare in that aspect? Let's get on with that then. Oh boy, let's get into the good stuff. 16-Bit Demake, as said previously, chose to rework many elements of the original level design. This was done to accommodate for some of the changes that the main skeleton of the experience has seen. If you've played X8 a lot, you will notice some of these modifications as early as the intro stage. The removal of enemy gauntlets improves the pacing a little bit, and so does the adjustments that the guard break mechanic has seen. Interestingly enough, you cannot revisit Noah's Park in this game, but that is hardly an issue, considering this stage no longer holds any collectibles or important items, and those that were here have been moved to somewhere else across the 8 main stages. About those Maverick levels, allow me to start with the 2 that have changed the most, which are Central White and Dynasty. And when I say change, I mean that they are actual proper levels now. Ride chasers are still a prominent element on these 2 stages, but they are implemented in a much more natural way, with challenges designed around the capabilities of these vehicles. Central White is more action-oriented, with a mini-boss and many enemies that will try to either stop you on your tracks or straight up get you off the bike. Meanwhile, Dynasty is more like an obstacle course. This stage also sports some pretty fun puzzles, involving lifts that you need to activate by pressing these buttons, and an indoor section focused on the more traditional jumping and shooting. Speaking of the old shooteroo, Booster Forest and Primrose are the levels that have changed the least, being almost 1-1 with their original counterparts. That is not a problem though, because they were some of the most solid levels in that game, and they are perfectly represented in 16-bit Demake. Primrose has different puzzles based around changing gravity, and Booster Forest is all about blowing up stuff with the new Cyclops Ride armor. In fact, the Demake made this level way more fun, because not only the armor controls are way better, but the reward for taking the Cyclops to the end of the stage is different. In the original, you'd obtain a bunch of element medals and the shield armor for 0. Here, the reward is being able to take the armor into the boss fight with Bamboo Pandemonium. As for the other levels that have seen some changes, we can start with Choya Base. In Vanilla X8, the stage inhabited by Optic Sunflower was designed around various enemy gauntlets and short platforming challenges, where depending on your performance, you'd be sent to different routes. Performing well was the key to obtaining all hidden collectibles in the stage, and that idea has been represented in 16-bit Demake in a more simple manner. Here you get a rank depending on how well you do, just like how Cyber Peacock's stage handled this concept in X4. You get points by destroying enemies, and you lose them if you take damage. Get to the end of one section with an A or S rank and you'll get a prize. Speedrun stages are very fun when the level design is specifically built around it, and this is gladly one of those cases. As for Metal Valley, the original featured two different chase sequences, a mini-boss and then the fight against Earthrock Trilobite. The version of this stage in 16-bit Demake is different, yet I believe it's much more entertaining. You still have one chase sequence and the mini-boss, but the rest of the stage is entirely new. There are various platforming challenges that will have you fighting enemies on very irregular terrain, forcing you to adapt to foes that come from very different directions. That said, not all changes are good, unfortunately. Inferno used to be one of the game's low points, due to the constant auto-scroller sections, instant kill hazards, and enemy gauntlets. In the Demake, while I appreciate the first slow scrolling section being gone, level design remains the same. And since this game uses a 16:9 ratio, it's harder to see some of these obstacles coming up. The latter half of this level introduces a new section where you need to progress through some tricky platforming while being chased by lava. On the other hand, it also removes the final escape sequence after defeating Burn Rooster. Knowing how the lack of auto-scrolling made the initial descent into the stage much more fun, it would have been cool to see how this one would have looked like. Last but not least, there's Pitch Black. The stage remains very close to the original, however it kinda feels like a decaffeinated version of itself. This level introduces some minor stealth mechanics, where if you get spotted by any of the searchlights or sensors, an alarm will trigger and you'll be attacked by groups of enemies. However, the punishment for failing this feels a bit less meaningful now, since instead of swarms of enemies, you'll only see 2 or 3 going after you. You'd think that the less punishing nature of this level would make it a good pick for the first destination after leaving Noah's Park. However, near the end of the stage, there's this section that is just barely possible to clear with excess standard equipment, which can be a total roadblock considering how failing to perform this jump results in an instant kaboom. Speaking of equipment, collectibles and armors have been moved around. I mentioned before how every item found in Noah's Park has been taken to somewhere else. Thing is, now that Dynasty can hold anything besides a boss fight, there is no need to locate something on the intro stage. The search for upgrades is very fun in this game, since their placements have been redesigned to streamline the process of gathering them. The PS2 incarnation of this game had a few armor parts that required a specific special weapon to be acquired, and if you didn't have it, a revisit was enforced. A good example is the armor capsule found at the end of Central White, that forced X to use Optic Sunflower's weapon to melt the ice and gain access to the capsule. Having to redo this stage was a tad annoying, since it used to be a pretty long auto-scroller, and you had to sit through the entirety of it, since it was located at the very end. In 16-bit Demake, the capsule is still at the end of the stage, but not only is the auto-scroller gone, you can now crash your Ride Chaser into the blocks, giving you free access to the part even if this is your first pick for a stage. And even when you need to use a weapon or an armor part to obtain a certain item, I really appreciate how 16-bit Demake allows players to use different options or strategies to reach their hidden locations. The combination of these improvements and the overall good choices to hide these items makes for a very fun power-up hunt that I believe anyone can clear without having to look up a guide. And I'm thankful for that, because trust me, you're going to need these parts. Which brings me to talk about how X8 16-bit Demake struggles a lot with its difficulty balancing, starting with let's get this out of the way first. Bosses in this game look and sound insanely good. They have beautifully animated sprites, no matter if they are huge or small, and each one of their movements is snappy and easily readable. What is not readable at all is their attack patterns, or lack thereof. Bosses in this demake do not have a set behavior. Instead, their next choice for an attack depends solely on RNG. Granted, that doesn't make a boss bad by itself. However, Mavericks in X8 have very aggressive moves, with almost zero wait time between attacks. The mix of these factors can turn fights into a bit of a mess, since your opponents are totally unpredictable, and you can find yourself in situations where staying safe from an incoming attack requires you to have the reflexes of a cat. Or, in the worst case scenario, you can be just unable to properly defend. In spite of that, the main reason why these bosses are so dangerous is that they all hit like a truck. Some moves can deplete more than half of X's health bar in just the blink of an eye, which makes the main character feel very underpowered at first. This sensation is amplified when you take into account the presence of overdrive attacks. When Mavericks go below 50% health, they enter overdrive mode. During this phase, they can either gain access to a new special move or add an extra layer of difficulty to their normal patterns, like Avalanche Yeti's giant snowflakes or Optic Sunflower's laser. In 16-bit Demake, these attacks are far more dangerous than what they used to be. Not only do they hit harder, but also, in most cases, Mavericks are now allowed to keep doing stuff while the overdrive attack is still going. This turns foes like Gravity and Tonion into a huge threat, since his giant blocks will keep falling down for the remainder of the fight, and that can lead to situations where evading damage is nigh impossible. Then there's Dark Mantis, who has an overdrive attack that is very tough to dodge, while being able to take you down in just 1 or 2 hits. The consequences of these design choices is that beating some stages as your first pick can be quite a struggle, and that can hurt the experience considering this is a game where you can go freely to any of the 8 stages in any desired order. A secondary effect comes in the form of how, since the damage values are that high, gathering armor parts and upgrades becomes almost a requirement, instead of a reward for players with a keen eye. Weapons and weaknesses are something you are also going to need to grasp if you want to get far in the adventure. These 8 weapons have seen some overhauls, and to be honest, they are far better than most of the OG counterparts. Almost all of them have seen various buffs, like Drift Diamond being a much more reliable spread shot, and Green Spinner gaining the ability to destroy spikes. Others have been reworked into much more useful incarnations, like Earth Crystal now being a triple shot that bounces off walls, Mailed Creeper being modified into a targeted dash attack, and Shining Ray's transformation into Optic Shield, a barrier weapon that deflects projectiles. They can still be a bit overshadowed by the armor's charge buster shots, but you are definitely going to find yourself using these a lot more. Charged versions have been modified too, giving X a much better and more varied arsenal. On the flip side, bosses won't flinch anymore after getting hit by the weakness, unless you hit them with the charged versions, which is an improvement in my opinion, since that used to drag down the pace of most fights. Speaking of improvements, one positive change introduced in 16-bit Demake is that boss health bars behave as they did in the classic X games, and iframes are much shorter now. For comparison, X8 introduced a weird system where bosses would become invincible at certain intervals, forcing you to go into the defensive for a few seconds. Despite it being a nice idea to stop players from brute forcing their way through these fights, in the end, the result was dragging the pace down into the mud, so I'm glad to see that being gone. Maverick fights, while unbalanced, can be pretty fun after all. It's just that you are most likely going to need to tinker with every stage for a bit longer than usual, and that can be a bad first impression. However, those fights are not the only aspect where 16-bit Demake feels noticeably off balance. Each of the 3 different endgame stages have seen various modifications, starting with the orbital elevator. Where the original worked as a survival test, the Demake introduces many platforming challenges which are very fun, and level design that remains interesting for the entirety of the stage, combining vertical and horizontal progression. Enemy placements, on the other hand, take a nosedive in quality from this point onward. Throughout the climb, you'll often run into foes that are placed in locations where hitting them can be quite a chore, or situations where getting hit will surely send you into a bottomless pit. And I think the perfect showcase for this is this baton, who is perfectly positioned in a way where hitting him with your normal buster is very tough, and if you happen to accidentally touch him, you are going straight into the pit below. There are multiple cases of this throughout the orbital elevator, but the biggest roadblock of all is Bile himself. Taking any hit from this guy just melts your HP as if it were a stick of butter in the middle of the desert. Even when using the Icarus armor, which halves all damage taken, this guy can still wreck your defenses in a bunch of taps. Granted, this is perfectly doable as an armored standard act, but attempting that would require the player to perform an almost perfect fight, which is quite exigent. The combination of these traits leads me to think that the game was not playtested too much while using an armored X. Most endgame stages are clearly designed around you having special armors and weapons, and that is another reason why gathering upgrades feels like an obligation now. I wanted to bring this up because this approach kinda goes against one of the key aspects that make the MegaMan X series so fun to replay. In those games, players can decide to avoid picking up certain upgrades, thus choosing their own customizable degree of challenge. Most of the official games are designed to allow you to reach the final boss on a low-level run, if you're that good of a player that is. In 16-bit Demake, when you take into account the unpredictability of Mavericks, on top of clunky enemy placements and the ludicrous damage values of endgame fights, you'll soon notice how low-level runs are a gargantuan task. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's the point, right? The difference is in how fair it feels to play that way. Official games don't incentivize you to pull off one of these, however they do not deter you from trying it, which is a thing that I can't say about X8's Demake. Moving on, Gateway is the second endgame level, and it's probably one of the coolest stages in the entire game. This is where the boss refights are taking place, but instead of putting you against the Mavericks once more, the teleporters take you to a small sub-level that brings back obstacles and challenges from the 8 main stages. Playing through this was a blast, and it felt like a final test before facing the bosses for the last time. As for the rematches themselves, you fight bosses in sets of 2, which is a very cool idea that sadly doesn't work because of the RNG nature of these guys. I think this section suffers from the same issue as the X challenge, you know, the one on the X Legacy collections, in that pitching you against 2 fellows at once sounds great on paper, but since none of these dudes are designed to coexist with each other, it leads to patterns that are a total mess, and the experience ends up being not that fun. One cool thing about this system though is how you get the chance to choose which bosses you want to pair up with each other, by carefully choosing which capsules you want to enter. Let me tell ya, if Mavericks weren't as unpredictable as they are, this would have been my favorite boss rush in the entire franchise. One funny thing that you can do, by the way, is to break the capsules by using Green Spinner, thus bypassing the limit on how many Mavericks you can fight at once. So yes, indeed, you can fight all 8 Mavericks in one go, and that is some self-imposed chaos I can enjoy. As for Copy Sigma, who'll ambush you right before escaping the stage, Holy cow, what happened here? This fellow is like a combination of every trait that bosses have in this game, except they are cranked up to 200%. He is insanely well animated, he has very cool and varied attacks, but he's a hard-hitting, unpredictable son of a gun. Every single one of his moves gives you very little time to get away, and since he can do them whenever he feels like, you can get easily pummeled to the moon and back. This becomes more evident as soon as he activates his overdrive attack, which only leaves a small area of safe ground. I think this is much easier to explain with a visual example. With almost the entire ground covered by fire, you can only stay safe by clinging to the walls or standing in this small section of the room. You cannot reach the opposite wall without using this free piece of floor, but there will be situations where Sigma will land on that chunk, leaving you stuck in place unless you want to take damage. He can then decide to be a douchebag and start spamming this screen clear attack, which can only be dodged by carefully dashing at the right time. Something that is not possible in this situation, since there isn't enough room to do so. For me, this was the toughest fight in the entire game, and not for the right reasons. Luckily, even if you game over, you don't need to face the boss rush again, but man, what a difficulty spike. Speaking of spikes, Sigma Palace is mostly the same as the original, though the spike room now requires you to use Bamboo Pandemonium's weapon or equip the Icarus foot parts, because otherwise you can't make it by simply jumping. This happens because the room is not as cramped as the original, but that's okay. Nevertheless, the final destination of X's journey is pretty nicely designed, aside from this occasion where you can get jump scared by a bottomless pit. As for the final boss, you'll face the real Sigma, then Lumine, and finally his Seraph form. They share the same design choices as any other fight in the game, which I have already discussed in detail throughout the video. I should mention that I don't think boss fights are totally unfun in 16-bit Demake, but they really stick out in a game like this. It's a fun project that has an insane amount of polish when it comes to visuals and core mechanics, yet it's a game where bosses can create bullet hell patterns and then immediately cover half of your screen with a different attack. It feels kinda unfair, not unbeatable, but slightly beyond the line of honest difficulty. After putting an end to Lumine's insanity, the game has some extra cool secrets that fans of the franchise are definitely going to love. But since X is already traveling back home, I guess I should wrap this up and give you my final thoughts on the game. Here we go then. MegaMan X8 16-bit Demake is a very impressive project. It's an adaptation of one of the most divisive titles in the franchise, and one that manages to improve on a wide variety of the original's flaws, while sporting insanely good visuals that demonstrate that a lot of care was put into this. It also manages to separate itself from the source material in many ways, while making up for the shortcomings of that decision with very witty design choices, backed up by a surprising attention to detail. That same polish and refining is what's missing on other key aspects of the entire package, and that leads to issues that, despite not being bad enough to sour anyone's experience on their own, the combination of all of them can definitely diminish your enjoyment of the journey. My only wish is that, if updates ever come out in the near future, it would be very cool to see some tweaks to those core flaws. And the reason why I say that is because there is a lot of potential here. 16-bit Demake could be a contender for one of the best MegaMan X games ever made, even among the official ones. It goes to show how far passion projects can go, and I will be forever happy to see them appear in the future. Be that as it may, in its current state, MegaMan X8 16-bit Demake is a title whose skyward trajectory is just a finger's length away from reaching the stars. This is BurnCrowSP, and thank you all for watching.